The title of my talk is Science and Metaphysics in the Light of Quantum Mechanics. Obviously, it will be concerned with the relation between, with a possible relation between science and metaphysics. And this relation, I will try to establish something through quantum mechanics. I chose this topic because as I started studying the philosophy of quantum mechanics, when you read some of the founding fathers of the theory like Schrödinger, Hermann Weyl, there is an issue about identity and individuality of quantum particles that appears everywhere in their writings. And by reading them, you have the impression that there's something very nice about quantum mechanics and individuality. That is, they say it in multiple ways, that quantum entities lost their individuality, lost their identity. So, in a sense that things like people and chairs are individuals, quantum particles are not individuals. They are non-individuals, according to these guys. So, when I first read it, I got very impressed. I'm very happy, because that will be a sign that metaphysics may be done in a scientific way. You may get information about the metaphysics of the world by through quantum mechanics, and that would be very nice. Obviously, that didn't last very long, because things do not happen so fast. You cannot just read the metaphysics of the world, and not only that, you not only discover that you cannot infer that there are non-individuals in whatever sense you take that to be. From quantum mechanics, you cannot just do that. There's something even worse than that, if you like metaphysics and quantum mechanics and want those things together, which is a current topic on the relation between metaphysics and science and philosophy of science, as you know. There seems to be a current, I mean current is because it comes from the last 10 years or so that it has become a very huge topic, the relation between analytic philosophy or analytic metaphysics and science. The main claim is that, as I will show very soon, analytic philosophy or analytic metaphysics is totally divorced from science. So that hope that I had in trying to read the metaphysics from quantum mechanics, they are not only false, but rather most of the literature on analytic metaphysics seems to be totally divorced from science. That's a major complaint. And the point is that while science is epistemically respectable, has progressed through the years, metaphysics, and in special analytic metaphysics, has not. It is not epistemically respectable, and most of its debates are said to be sterile. So I got from very high hopes to very little hopes, you see. So that's one of the problems. How do we bring those issues together again? How is there any hope for making metaphysics respectable, in a sense that this respectability could somehow be tied to science? I would like to examine this issue, how the debate is framed, mainly by philosophers of science, the guys that are complaining that analytic metaphysics is divorced from science. I will try to address their points and see where it leads. So my plan, I will tell you very soon, is as follows. I try to present the challenge for analytic metaphysics, that claims that, well, analytical metaphysics is totally unrelated from science. So it will be a challenge to bring it back close to science. I will try to point some confusions, that's part of my talk, in this kind of accusation. There is a lot of things going on that I believe that would be better understood if we could distinguish some things. In particular, I would say right now, if we could distinguish ontology as a specific part of metaphysics and metaphysics as a broader area of inquiry. If we can do that, I think some of the issues raised by these guys disappear. I will present some examples to illustrate how this conflation between ontology and what I would call metaphysics, I know it's not very standard terminology, how these examples, this example will illustrate how this conflation of notions may cause us trouble. I will introduce an important notion of metaphysical underdetermination, metaphysics gets underdetermined by physics. So if you're looking to quantum mechanics to try to extract your metaphysics, you won't be able to do that, because there are many possible ways to address the metaphysics of reality according to quantum mechanics, and they are not compatible, and they are all compatible with the theory. And I will argue that attempts to break this underdetermination by those people that were accusing analytic metaphysics of being irrelevant to science are also on the same cart as everyone else, so they're not better off. And I shall then advance a kind of possible relation between metaphysics and science. I hope it all makes sense in the end when the big picture is arrived at. So, what are the problems for analytical metaphysics, and why then should we try to bring them together, metaphysics and science? The problem, there is a very strong accusation in this book by Ladyman and Ross, Everything Must Go, is a very famous, and I think a lot of people have quoted this passage, some endorsing it, some complaining about it, that they say that standard analytic metaphysics or new scholastic metaphysics contributes nothing to the human knowledge, and where it has any impact at all, systematically misrepresents the relative significance of what we do know on the basis of science. Their conclusion is that we should stop analytic metaphysics. That's an enterprise that should be stopped because it's irrelevant to knowledge. Mainly because it is not related to science. So that's why it's important to try to relate it back again. Because the main idea here seems to be that science would confer some kind of respectability to the metaphysics. If it is developed independently of science, well, then it ends up being irrelevant. Other people have provided for similar claims. I will be bringing those claims as I go on, and as I try to disentangle some of the concepts. So the diagnosis is that analytic metaphysics is developed in isolation from science, and of course that's the worst for metaphysics, and science suffers nothing. How are these points addressed in general? This kind of irrelevance, how should it be? The point is that if you want to get some respectability back to metaphysics, according to these people, science should confer some kind of epistemic warrant for metaphysical claims. This appears as the claim that we should try to bridge the gap between science and metaphysics. Given that science is a kind of privileged epistemic endeavor that we have, it's the successful one to know the world, we should try to bridge the gap between science and metaphysics. This is one of the claims, that analytic metaphysics is not bridging the gap, it's opening the gap. The second kind of claim that people trying to make this relation closer and complaining from traditional metaphysics do is that metaphysics should somehow fit scientific theories. And this is a claim by Simon Saunders, for instance, that we should tailor the metaphysics to suit the physics. So physics is there, it puts some constraints, and we should just get the metaphysics from those constraints. It's a kind of, we can somehow rid of what is the metaphysical content of the world from this physics. The other aspect of this criticism that I would like to address is that science is responsible for somehow for the metaphysical profile, this is a nice word, metaphysical profile, of the entities it posits. So, for instance, you have quantum mechanics and it posits electrons and photons, protons, neutrons. Quantum mechanics should somehow be responsible for what they are. So, for instance, if you're thinking about individuality, then you should get this information. Are they individuals? Are they not individuals? From quantum mechanics. That's a kind of respectable metaphysics according to these guys. So you're not getting any information floating around and then you check whether it works in quantum mechanics. No. The theory is responsible for the metaphysical profile of the entity it posits. And now, so this is, these are topics from people that complain of traditional metaphysics divorced from science. They try to do that. They try to read the metaphysics from science and obtain the metaphysical profile of the entities. I shall be talking about this very soon, because this is one of my important points that I should I shall address right now. That is this ambiguity between ontology and metaphysics. If you go to that book by Ladyman and Ross, and most people that think that metaphysics should be analytic, in general they trace the debate on ontology to Carnap and Quine, a famous debate, and they claim that those guys were doing real scientific ontology because they were linked to science, they were related. Somehow metaphysics fell out of the tracks, lost its way, and it is this mess today. But these guys were doing some respectable metaphysics, Quine and Carnap. Of course they didn't agree, but that's another story. So for instance, Putnam put it in a very nice way. He says, if we ask when ontology became a respectable subject for an analytic philosopher to pursue, the mystery disappears. It became respectable in 1948 when Quine published a famous paper titled On What There Is. It was Quine who single-handedly made ontology a respectable subject. So if we somehow think that ontology is the whole of metaphysics, of course, then doing metaphysics is make this catalog of what there is. That's the task of metaphysics, to write a list of the things that exist. And also, Quine provided for a very nice answer that seems metaphysically interesting and also respectable in the lights of these guys that want to make a scientific metaphysics, because he has an answer to that. Of course, it's not an easy answer, but he said, how do I know what there is? Well, I am naturalist. I believe that science comes first, and I am a realist. I believe in the posits that science posits. So what is there? Well, what our best scientific theories say they are. So there are electrons, protons, and these things. That's at least if we take that literally, that's what making ontology is, according to him. We should examine our best scientific theories. And here's how Tim Maudlin puts the same question. I know I am quoting a lot of people, but I hope they will lead us to the point. Evidence for what exists, at least in the physical world, is provided solely by empirical research. Hence, the proper object of most metaphysics is the careful analysis of our best scientific theories, and especially of fundamental physical theories, with the goal of determining what they imply about the constitution of the physical world. So, that's very clearly here that most of metaphysics is analysis of physical theories, so you can determine what there is according to the physical theories. Of course, the analysis is not easy or simple. You cannot straightforwardly infer what there is. But now, instead of talking about ontology, people are talking about metaphysics, and almost all of metaphysics, if it is going to be something respectable from a scientific point of view, must be concerned with analyzing our best scientific theories. That's one of the fundamental points. What I would like to point to here is that this kind of conflation between ontology and metaphysics seems to be behind much of the complaint about analytic metaphysics. If you think that metaphysics is just ontology, then metaphysics is just a catalog of what there is. And of course, this is not what the so-called neo-medieval approach to metaphysics tries to describe our approach. I would like to say that while of course there is a problem of ontology that may be addressed by examining scientific theories, for instance, what exists according to quantum mechanics or to relativity theory, there is also another problem which concerns the metaphysical profile of what exists. That is really addressed by the new medieval metaphysicians, if you like this term, or analytic metaphysicians. So while you can infer, for instance, or you can try to figure out from quantum mechanics that there are electrons and protons, that's not the kind of activity that most of analytic metaphysicians are engaged in. They are trying to discuss issues about individuality or the nature of properties, for instance, that you cannot infer from a catalog of what there is according to quantum mechanics. So, for instance, if you say that according to quantum mechanics there are electrons and protons, that still says nothing about their individuality or their non-individuality. That still says nothing about the nature of their properties and their relations. So that's the point. I think that new medieval metaphysics is a kind of investigation that was not the one that Quine was trying to rehabilitate. They work on a more general basis. If you go, I like very much a distinction that Chakravarti made in Principia. He said, well, there is the metaphysics of the metaphysics course, where you study universals, possible worlds, individuation. And of course, there is the problem of realism, what a theory says there is. And those two issues are certainly conflated when we say that ontology is metaphysics. You won't get answers to the problems of individualities or the nature of universals by making a catalog of what there is according to quantum mechanics. So those are complementary inquiries. So my other example is, if you are a realist about mathematics, that by itself means that, well, you have examined mathematics and you believe in the existence of entities posed by mathematics, posited by mathematics. That by itself does not solve the problem of the nature of those objects. There are many ways to cache the nature of mathematical entities, and that, I think, is the point of doing new medieval metaphysics, because that's where those discussions are about. You discuss about the metaphysical profile of those objects. So, making a catalog of what there is not to address the same problem as the problem of the metaphysical profile of those entities. Those are complementary investigations. So that will have to do with the problem of claiming that analytic metaphysics is totally unrelated from science. As an example of this kind of, how this kind of discussion, of a distinction that I am bringing here is important, I would like to discuss, to begin with, a point by Alisa Ney. She proposed what she calls new positivistic metaphysics. And basically she has an idea that we can have a scientifically respectable metaphysics by examining the formulation of scientific theories. Then you can have a nice metaphysics by there. I have a very long quote from her here. I'm not going to read it all. But her point is very simple. She says that perhaps there are some elements in the formulation of the theory that are somehow indispensable, that you cannot do without. If you take the most important formulations, for instance, of quantum mechanics, there may be some item there that you cannot abandon. So, and she argues for this. She says that, well, so if this happens, if you can find some representational element in a scientific theory that is not eliminable, we should be committed to that item. And she modifies the famous Quinean, Putnam-Quine indispensability argument that we ought to have ontological commitment to this kind of entities. So we should be committed to some of these entities that are represented by these ineliminable elements in formulations of theories. That's a very strange claim, but that's not my point now. The point is that she thinks that, for instance, this would favor a view she likes very much, that is wave function realism. Because she takes, well, consider quantum mechanics. What is really indispensable in the formulations of quantum mechanics? Well, she says there are some formulations of it that you cannot formulate without the notion of wave function. So it is, according to the argument, it is very reasonable to suppose that wave functions are real. So that's wave function realism. That's a strange point of view, but there are some people that believe in that. So that would be a kind of way to relate science and metaphysics. You have the metaphysics extracted from science. The point, according to the distinctions I was trying to articulate in the beginning, that once you made a catalog of what there is, that still does not give us an answer to the important question of the metaphysical profile of this thing. So, for instance, a listener recognized that there is still much work to do around that is not derived from science. But the main point, I think, was addressed by Stephen French, when he says, well, okay, let us consider that we are wave function realists, that Ney's argument worked, and that we all agree that there are wave functions. There are still some further questions, he says, about how should we metaphysically address these things. Of course, wave functions are fields in physical terms, and but as far as you are told that there are wave functions, you know nothing about their metaphysical profile. And he says, French likes very much to create this kind of arguments. He says, well, we have at least two possible candidates to provide a metaphysical understanding of these fields. The details are not important for us, but he says the field may be understood as a global particular, which is a form of objectivism, or two, as involving a version of configuration space substantivalism, in which the field is a kind of substance. So in this sense, quantum mechanics by itself helps us with nothing. You cannot decide that the field is a global particular or a kind of substance. And this is the metaphysical dressing that I was talking about. From quantum mechanics, you may extract, if you agree with Ney, that there are wave functions. But that's as far as it can go. You cannot determine whether this field is a global particular or a substance, a kind of substance. So we fall prey to metaphysical underdetermination. Science cannot decide this issue. And so that is where I think that analytical metaphysics is a helpful tool, because, well, that's the kind of point that it does address. It does not concern itself with the catalog, precisely with the catalog of reality according to quantum mechanics, but with this metaphysical profile. So if you are looking for issues about whether there are whether the wave function is a substance or a global particular, that will not be found in an analysis of quantum mechanics by itself. So you're asking too much. And the same problem appears in the metaphysics of individuality in quantum mechanics, that French and Ladyman, the guy that was complaining so strongly, were. If we consider the debate on individuality and non-individuality of quantum mechanics that I started with, well, it is known that quantum mechanics is compatible with both a metaphysics of individuals and a metaphysics of non-individuals. As you know, as you may know, the main problem with quantum mechanics is that quantum entities are indiscernible. There is nothing in the theory that you can employ to discern those things. I will come back to this later. But that was the point in French and Krause's book about individuality and identity. So there's no quantum property that you can employ to discern, for instance, two electrons that are entangled, or two photons. And what this leads to is a kind of a failure of theories of individuality that depend on discerning by properties. But there are other theories of individuality. For instance, if you are individuated by a substratum, a bare particular, a hazy, that are compatible with indiscernible individuals. So there is something there that confers the individuality. And also, of course, the theory is compatible with some versions of non-individuality, that these entities do not have a hazy, that they are indiscernible, they fail the principle of the identity of indiscernibles. So you can, after you have selected, you have decided that there are electrons and photons, when you go to address this metaphysical profile, quantum mechanics says nothing about this. It gets underdetermined once again. So there's more underdetermination. And where, again, new medieval metaphysics, new scholastic metaphysics gets in, because that's their issue. So how do they suggest, and that's where the Aquinas picture comes back. That was the purpose of the first part. Because here is how Ladyman puts the issue. Of course, you are being realist about quantum mechanics. You believe that electrons exist and protons. And now you know that you cannot decide on purely quantum mechanical grounds whether they are individuals or non-individuals. So what should you do? Here's Ladyman. He says, we need to recognize the failure of our best theories to determine even the most fundamental ontological characteristic of the purported entities they feature. That is, if you look to quantum mechanics, you won't have these most fundamental ontological features of those entities, which I was calling the metaphysical profile. Quantum mechanics cannot do that. However, he's not happy with that. He says, I love this quote. He says, it is an ersatz form of realism that recommends belief in the existence of entities that have such ambiguous metaphysical status. That is, you cannot be a realist. You cannot quantify over electrons, photons, and still not be able to decide the metaphysical status. So they are expecting to extract this information about the metaphysical status from the realistic content of a theory, if you take this terminology from Harterfield. So you are being realist about electrons. Well, that should determine the metaphysical status too. It has a double duty to do. You have the realistic content, well, it's electrons, and the metaphysical profile, it is an individual, let's say. But you cannot do that. So what Ladyman suggests, what is required is a shift to a different ontological basis altogether, one for which questions of individuality simply do not arise. So he expects still to solve the problem with the same approach, with the Aquinas approach or something like that, where you have the two tasks conflated together. He wants to change the ontological basis for one in which you can solve both problems. You are being realist about something, and you also know the metaphysical profile of this something. And of course, he's suggesting that we change to what is called structural realism. By this point, Ladyman suggested that we should just, given that there is this indecision between individuals, non-individuals, and the theory by itself cannot decide, he does not want to go to metaphysics and try to decide that on a course of metaphysics. No, that should be an issue for quantum mechanics. So we should change the basis. That means stop talking about objects, forget about objects, and shift your focus to relations. That's what's important. The same point, very much the same, is put by French and Krause when they speak about the theoretical content of quantum mechanics. They say, if that theoretical content is taken to have a metaphysical component, so there it is again, in the sense that the realist's commitment to a particular ontology needs to be articulated in metaphysical terms. So if you are realist about electrons, that commitment must be articulated in metaphysical terms. You have to decide some metaphysical issues. And in particular, with regard to the individuality or non-individuality of the particles, that is, this commitment needs to be articulated in metaphysical terms, in particular with regard to individuality and non-individuality. Then the realist appears to face a situation in which there are two metaphysically inequivalent approaches between which no choice can be made based on physics itself. So again, that's the same point. You have your realistic commitment with some entities, and they seem to think that this commitment just by itself must determine the metaphysical component. And the choice for the realist is stark. Either fall into some form of anti-realism or drop the aforementioned metaphysical component and adopt an ontologically less problematic position. So their suggestion is, again, they're not suggesting it there in this book, but Frank suggests all the time that we should shift from an ontology of objects. Well, if you are committed to electrons, it seems that you're committed to a particular object, So they forget about objects and focus on relations and structure, because it seems if you are being realist about relations and structure, then you can accomplish the task. You have your commitment and the metaphysical nature of those entities. So it seems that we could achieve the goal if we forget about objects and focus on structures and relations and these things that the structural realist is concerned with. And that would be, of course, a kind of, if that were successful, then we would have this reading of the ontology, which comes with a metaphysical profile. That led even Fred Müller to claim that there is not really underdetermination of metaphysics. There is determination of metaphysics. He was having in mind, of course, structural realism. Said, well, I will discuss it very soon. He calls determination thesis. Scientific theories are incompatible with some specific metaphysical views. In other words, he thinks that those are synonymous. They do have some definite ontological content. And he seems to believe that this ontological content of scientific theories, in particular of quantum mechanics, is a structural realist content. Quantum mechanics imposes on us a metaphysics of structures and relations. That's what he believes. So he seems to forget the first part of the formulation of incompatibility and focus on the second part. They do have some ontological ontological content, and it's a very specific content. So if that worked, that would be a very nice discovery, because we would have a metaphysics that is extracted from science, again, from quantum mechanics. The point is that the Müller draws is simple. I will just use the board here, because I mentioned previously that quantum entities are indiscernible. Nothing whatever in quantum mechanics discerns those entities. But that is not true. Müller and Saunders and other guys, they discovered that there are some kind of relations in quantum mechanics that are set weakly discerning relations. This is the name. They are relations that are symmetric. That's a relation R. And if X is related to Y, then we also determine that Y is related to X. So these relations cannot discern the entities by the order of their relation. You cannot say that X is different from Y because X is related to Y, but Y is not related to X. So the order of the relation will not work to discern. So this is a symmetric relation. However, this is a near-reflexive relation. So we can discern X and Y, at least they say so, because we know that X is not related to X, while X is related to Y, and Y to X. And Y is also not related to Y. So that's a kind of discerning relation that may be derived from quantum mechanics. That's a kind of theorem for the theory, the existence of this kind of relation. So that would be very nice if this could imply something in ontology, because it would be a kind of theorem of quantum mechanics that you have some ontological content there. And that would be very, of course, very scientific. But the problem is, erase this part. So that means that we should focus on relations. The relations are the most important things. They make the discerning. And that's what Saunders was speaking about when he said that we should tailor the metaphysics to suit the physics. The physics provides for the relations. And whenever we know that there is a weakly discerning relation, for instance, we know that there are two entities. So we should provide the two entities there. We are tailoring them for the physics. So physics should be understood as committing us to certain type of relations. The priority should be on relations. The focus is on relations. The point is that even that is not enough. That will not do what French and also Ladyman were asking, that we shift to another ontological basis and then we solve the problem of both the realist content and the metaphysical content, the profile of the entities. Because if we focus on relations, and in particular weakly discerning relations, we may find in papers by French and other people that there are at least 5 possible metaphysical profiles that are compatible with it. So, again, they are conflating the issues. Of course, you may think that all that there is are relations, but that does not speak about what kind of metaphysical profile the entities there have. For instance, you may have what I call a one-category ontology, that there are relations and also there are objects constituted by those relations, such as bundles of relations. That would be difficult to defend, of course, but that's a possibility. Or one can follow Saunders himself, one of the proponents of this approach, when he defended that this approach implied what is called by Lowe, for instance, a no-category ontology. There are objects that the entities one is quantifying over and just there, objects. Because they are discernible, they have identity conditions. No focus on relations. Also, one may frame this in a two-category ontology. Objects and relations are primitive entities, and objects now are understood as what is called bare relation bearers. That's a very nice name, because they don't have no intrinsic properties. They have only relations. So this is a different metaphysical profile for what's going on. And there is a symmetric dependence relation between them. Objects depend on relations, relations depend on objects. None of them take priority. This is what is called in the structural realist literature the moderate ontic structural realism. It's one view. You have relations, the focus is on relations, but you don't eliminate the objects. You just eliminate their intrinsic properties. In the second, the fourth option is again a two-category ontology. There are objects and relations. Again, objects have no intrinsic property conferring them individuality or whatever. They are what is called bare relation bearers, again, by French. And there is an asymmetric dependence between them. Objects do depend on relations. All their features depend on relations. And finally, there is a fifth option that is a one-category ontology. Only relations exist. That's the option by Stephen French. And objects essentially depend on relations. Their essence is dependent on relations. So that's eliminativism of objects. All there is relations. This is the option that Ladyman was advancing in the beginning. He said, well, shift your basis in general and then you eliminate the problem. That's the point that French was mentioning in the quote of French and Krause. So if you think about weakly discerning relations, they do not really imply that we have an answer for the metaphysical profile of the entities. There are many ways to fill the gaps that are incompatible, and we still have underdetermination. That does not follow from quantum mechanics, that we do have any specific ontology there, or metaphysics, in my distinction. So we still have underdetermination, even for structural realists. You may change the ontological basis and still have underdetermination, because, again, I think that the diagnosis is that they are confusing the realistic content with the metaphysical profile. Now I have some examples of the discussion and how it goes, because they are trying to be really attached to science. So on the one hand we have Esfeld and Lamb. They are moderate structural realists, and they think that science only grants their view of structural realism. And they argue that this elimination of objects proposed by Stephen French and Ladyman in the beginning really goes against science, because science does not grant that you should eliminate objects. That's going too far. So there is no justification from science to be an eliminativist. On the other hand, French, which is the eliminativist, says that, well, to have relations and objects as primitive in your ontology is wrong, because these objects that are postulated to have any worth in this context it needs a physical correlate, and there is no physical correlate to this aspect of putative objects, then his claim is, again, that science does not warrant the introduction of this kind of objects. So it seems science tells very different stories for different people. And of course, that's how it should be, because it's not a transparent thing. This is an example of how those versions of structural realism all appeal to science, and how they are incompatible, and we still have underdetermination. So the point is, how should we then try to relate those things? My suggestion is that we forget this attempt to read both kind of commitments, the realist commitment and the metaphysical profile at the same time. And recall, this is not a very positive approach, I know, but it is very difficult to be very positive in this issue. Recall Miller, and I had made this suggestion also, that quantum mechanics is incompatible with some metaphysics. For instance, quantum mechanics is incompatible with some strong versions of bundle theory of individuality. According to this view, an individual is a bundle of properties. So what a particular object is just a collection of properties, the properties that make up that object. So this view of the bundle theory is committed to the principle of identity of indiscernibles. If objects A and B have all their properties in common, then they are the same bundle. So different objects must have different properties. According to quantum mechanics, that cannot be. You may have two objects and all the same properties. So if we take that seriously, quantum mechanics rules out bundle theory. So that's a nice starting point, I think, because at least we know that one of the candidates gets out of the way. Of course, we say, oh, but that's only one, there's still a lot of other ones. So, but it goes further. In a recent work by some colleagues of ours from Argentina, Christian de Honde, they examined the role of the so-called Jonas-Becker theorem in quantum mechanics. That's a theorem we derive in quantum mechanics, and it basically, I will simplify a lot, it says that you cannot attribute values 1 and 0, that means that an object has or does not have a property globally. Once you select an object and try to measure one property, that determines a small set of properties that are compatible with this one, and there is a whole set of other properties that you cannot determine whether the object has or not. It's not consistent with the theory. So, in this sense, the theorem says that quantum objects are very different from classical objects. From a classical object, you can always say, except for vague cases, that it does have or does not have a property. It always either have or not have. In this case, it does not make sense to say that it does have or not have every property that the system may have. So they take it to imply that they don't call it in these terms, but I would like to call it those constitutive theories of particular objects. That is, those theories that say that an object is composed by its properties, the properties it does have. So instantiation means that the property is a component of the object. Are ruled out, because in general you cannot determine whether some properties are component or not. The theory says that it makes no sense to speak about it. So this compositional view of objects, and I think that maybe Paul's mereological bundle theory, in which a property is a part of the individual, would be ruled out, because you cannot claim that for any property whatever, the object either has it or does not have it. So that's a huge class of theories of particular objects that may be ruled out by quantum mechanics. So the very nature of particular objects will have to be revised. There's a lot of theories that are not compatible with the theory. So, and it is my proposition that then there is a kind of objective relation between metaphysics and quantum mechanics. Metaphysics on this very substantial sense of metaphysical profile that you cannot extract from the theory, like the realistic content, that we may try to relate it in a negative way. We may try to discover some of the options that do not work. And of course, leave the others for further work, further articulation, and then I'll come back to this very soon. So that's my point. When we try to determine this relation, perhaps the best we can do is to decide how not to articulate the metaphysical nature of the entities that are posed. And of course, quantum mechanics is so strange that it will rule out many options. And of course, there is always underdetermination available. And one option that that many people advance is that we should appeal to theoretical virtues now. Well, check simplicity and intuitiveness and non-ad hocness, and then we can decide for a metaphysical theory. Another option that I like very much from Jirebenovsky is that, well, these metaphysical views, they are like, they have an aesthetical value, and we choose them because of their beauty. But of course, that's a very anti-realistic view on metaphysics. So there are many ways to go from now. I sincerely don't know how to go from there. But I think that the point is, as a paper by Taku and Morganti says, that science, in the case of this high-level metaphysics, is a test field for metaphysics. So you cannot get the metaphysics from the science, but at least you can test your metaphysics on science. And if you agree that science has a privileged status, then to have your favorite theory incompatible with it, that should be a sign of danger for you. That's the kind of relation I think it's possible. And I think that many people are saying this too. So that's it.